All right, so before we get to UV mapping the chess set in order to be able to put textures on it, I want to explain a little bit what UV mapping is and how to think about it before you go ahead and start doing it. So, UV mapping is the way that we take a three-dimensional object and then represent it in a two-dimensional format. Okay. The reason that we do this is initially when we had to do textures, we had to do them in a 2D painting program like Photoshop. And obviously, back then you didn't have the ability to just paint on the model. But even now, with being able to paint on the model, the textures that you create for your objects are still stored in a 2D format, in a TIFF or a JPEG or, a PNG or whatever it is. So that data has to be translated from a three-dimensional form into a two-dimensional form. Now, how that looks is if we come in here and look at this. I think this is an axis deer, right? As it is right here is in its full three-dimensional form. Typically, when hunters take game like this, they want to keep the pelt. So to get that pelt from that three-dimensional form to a more two-dimensional form, you're going to have to make some cuts somewhere. And where you make that cuts depends on what you want the end result to be. With a deer like this, you gotta ask yourself which part of the deer is the part that I want to keep looking the best. That meaning that I don't want to cut through it. And typically that's like the top of the pelt. That's where these nice dots are, etc. So typically they'll cut, slice down the inside of the leg, both front and back, and then down the belly. And then just sort of once they get that off the body, then you can sort of lay it out flat. Now, in this case, obviously, we're not thinking of the guts and the organs and the bones and the muscles and stuff. We're just thinking about the outer shell, because obviously, if you had a 3D model of a deer, it would just be an empty shell with the all the stuff on the outer shell. Okay, so essentially, that is how we think about UV mapping. If you had modeled this deer and you wanted to texture it to look like a deer, your UV map would pretty much look like this. It'd be a two-dimensional representation of this 3D object. So some more examples. Same thing here. We got a white-tailed deer. Same thing. You can see that they want to keep the back part of it looking good. Not really too worried about the underside, which is just white. It's not that interesting. Same thing with a bear, right? Pretty much any animal that you skin, you're probably going to skin it in more or less this format here. Okay, this is a coyote, same deal. Tiger, same deal. So even if you were modeling one of these animals, when you go to do the UVs, you'd probably lay out the UVs in a format very similar to this, so that if you were painting in a 2D program like Photoshop, you would paint it like this. All these patterns that are really nice. You wouldn't cut a UV seam through here. You'd put it in a way where it's not going to cause as much trouble. Now, let's look at basically, if we're talking about more CG characters, this is a human character here. And this is how she's been laid out. You can see that this is her face and neck region here. You can see fingers, right? You can see this looks like legs. This is the front of the torso and the back of the torso. This looks like the arms, right? And here is the clothes, the shirt, etc., etc. So UV mapping is just a process of taking your 3D form, this 3D volume of a character, and telling the software where to cut those seams, just like if you were skinning that deer or that bear. Where do you want to make those cuts in order to be able to then unwrap or unfold that mesh so that it lays as close to flat as possible? And I say as close to flat as possible because there's, if something has a lot of curvature to it, you will never be able to lay it completely flat. Some things flatten out really well. For example, this Coke can right here. If you're making a Coke can, basically you would cut a seam around the top of this. Basically, it's a cylinder, right? So you would cut a seam around the top and then you cut a seam around the bottom, which is these two circular patches right here. Then you have this center section here, which is basically now when you've cut the seams around there, think of it as like an open top and bottom cylinder, like a toilet roll or something like that, like the cardboard in the roll. So from that point on, in order to be able to lay that cylinder out flat, you're going to have to split it up one side, right? If you take a used up toilet roll, where or paper towel roll where you've used up all the paper towels, and you have this cardboard cylinder, if you want to lay that out flat on the floor without anything overlapping anything else, you're going to have to split one of those sides, cut it right through, and then you can just sort of unfold it and lay it flat. And this is essentially what we have here. So this rectangular section is this cylindrical part of here, split at a certain point and then rolled out and laid flat. So if you were going to paint the Coke label in like Photoshop, it'd be very easy for you to get your paintbrushes and, do the logo or whatever, or just bring an image of Coke and sort of lay it in there. And then, take a picture of the top and the bottom and lay them on there. And then take that back into your 3D software and apply it to the object, and it would look like a Coke can. And then if you look at this 3D model that an artist has done here, right? If you look at the UV layout of the reindeer, it looks like those images of the animals that we had before, right? It's the same kind of layout. Sliced up, you can see the main part of the texture, the back part of the animal, because that is where you want it to be intact. You don't want any seams cutting through there, so you cut underneath down the legs and unfold it that way. So this is the 3D model without the texture, and this is the 3D model textured, and you can see the similarity between that and the real animals if you're going to skin out an animal. So if we go into Maya here, let's start real simple with something like a cube. So a cube, so if you make a cube in Maya, if I click on it, you'll see that the UVs, right? This is the 3D view right here, and this is the 2D view or UV editor. Okay, so the default UVs on any cube look like this. These are the 6 faces of the cube. A cube has 6 sides to it, so it's got 6 faces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. This is how they lay it out as sort of the default for a basic cube. And if this doesn't make sense, then all we have to do is, if I run my timeline here, you can see that if I was to open this up, that's what it would look like, right? Which now matches the 2D view. So if I took my 3-dimensional cube and had to figure out how to cut it in order to be able to lay it out flat, right? Say you had a cardboard box that didn't have any open sides. It was just a solid cardboard box. And your job was to open it up, figure out where to cut it to be able to open it up, right? So if I click off here, you can see these slightly thicker lines. Those are the seams, right? We call those seams, the areas where you have to split it and cut it in order to be able to open it up and lay it flat. Those are what we call seams. So these like thicker lines is where we'd have to do that. And the thin ones is where we're not cutting. So we'd have to cut around here, around this way, around there. And once we're done with that, you can see that it opens up, right? These 2 faces would just fold flat. Then these faces here would just open. And now you have this flat laying box here. So this is the 2-dimensional representation of that 3-dimensional object. Meaning now you can take this into texturing software. And if you want, like say you're making dice or whatever, you could put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You put the dots on there. And then you'd bring it back in here and it would transfer all that information from this 2-dimensional image onto the 3-dimensional model. Okay, so that is what we try to do when we lay out UVs. Okay, so it's a matter of looking at the object and deciding how are you going to cut this up in order for you to be able to open it up. And a lot of the times the trick is to cut it up with as few seams as possible. And also putting those seams in places where they're not going to be as visible or as noticeable. Now, in today's software, you can paint on the 3D object, so you can paint across seams to make them look better. But you still, you want to put them in places that kind of make sense. So that's the workflow that we're going to get into as we do the chess pieces. And I will go through it and I'll show you, why I cut things where I do and how I cut them. Okay, so we're going to get onto that next. So now we can look at our chess set and think about how we're going to UV map this so that we can put some texture on here. Say if you wanted to make it wood, right? You want to have wood grain running all through this or whatever it is. We need to lay the UVs out. If I select the pawn, you can see that the UVs that are on there by default are pretty much useless, right? I can't do anything with this. It's not going to look very good. And so we need to get rid of these. Now, the first thing we need to do is just create a new map that we can use to make sure that our texture's laying on there correctly and there's not a whole lot of stretching and stuff. And I use a checker map for that. Now, Maya has a built-in one. If I turn it on here, you'll see it gets put on there. But I don't really like to use that one because as soon as I deselect the object, it goes away. And I like to have it stay on there. So I'm going to turn this one off. And just go to, just right-click on the mesh here, go to assign a favorite material. I'm just going to use a Lambert because they're very simple. And there's my Lambert. I'll just call this checker map. There we go. Okay, and then in the color, I'm going to plug in a checker. And you can see that it's and if I turn on my image maps in here, right, you can see that that's what we have. Now, you see how even though it's a nice uniform checker map, when you see it on the object, it is not looking very good. That's because the UVs that are on the object are pretty much garbage UVs. And we just have to go in there and get rid of these default UVs and then create our own. Okay. Now, what I could also do in the checker map here is just go back in color. And right up here is a place 2D texture node. I like to turn this up. Let's try about 30 by 30. Just so that we have enough tiling that it's not just these massive squares. They're a lot smaller. Okay. So the first thing you want to do is get rid of the UVs as they stand. And the way we do that, I go in the make sure I'm in the modeling section here. I go to UV and I'll go to planar, but I want to go into settings. And just if I reset this, typically these are the settings here. Generally, I like to set this to project from the Z-axis. And I like to keep image width height ratio. That just makes sure that we don't have any stretching or squashing in the UV projection. So if I hit project, you can see now things look a little nicer, right? The squares are nice and uniform across there, but when you look here, you'll see that there's stretching. That's because this texture is being projected from one direction, and any of the faces that are sort of perpendicular to the angle of projection look really good. But as you start to hit the faces that are at an angle to the direction of the projection, you get stretching, which is what we're seeing right here. Okay, but this is a good starting point because all those junk UVs have kind of been removed. I'm going to turn off the image here just so we can see better. So what we need to do now is tell it where we want to put our seams. Right? Tell it where we want to cut those seams so that we can lay this thing flat. Remember that we are trying to create a two-dimensional representation of this thing. So we have to cut a bunch of seams and figure out how we're going to do that to lay it flat. So I'm going to go to UV here. And I'm going to use the 3D cut and sew UV tool. If I click on that, it's going to turn on here. But problem is right now I'm in face mode. So if I right click and go to component and then go to UV, go to edge, now I can, if I double click an edge, like for example, this bottom face here is pretty much flat. So we can separate it from the rest of the mesh by just double clicking, right? See that it changes to a different color? That's just Maya telling us that it's its own UV shell. So we can break up this pawn according to the logical sections of it, right? We have the base sort of face here. And that's pretty much close to flat already. So we can separate it from the rest of the mesh just to make our lives easier. Then we have this sort of bulbous section right here. We're going to split that off from the next section here just by double clicking this edge here. So that changes color. That's signifying that it's its own UV shell. Okay, then we go up here and double click here. So again, now these are pretty close to the same colors. Just the random colors that are picked sometimes are really close to each other. So that happens. If I do it again, let's see, will it pick the same color? It looks like it did. That's okay. So that's a separate UV shell. Now this bottom face right here is pretty flat. So I'm just going to double click there and let that be its own UV shell as well. And then this section here, we can just create a seam right there, just to make that be its own UV shell. Now we have this spherical section right here. And the problem with unfolding a sphere is that, the amount of stretching and distortion is going to be pretty severe. But I found a way to make it easier is to cut a seam right here, so that these faces here become their own UV shell, and that's pretty close to flat. And then we can now come in here and just pick where we want to put our seam. So just like a cylinder, we have to cut a seam going straight down. So if I double click there, that's going to be cut and open up real nice. The next section, the section here of the neck of the pawn, we can just double click here. That's again is a cylinder. It's like that Coke can. We just split it here and then unfold it. It's going to lay down pretty flat. We can also actually just split this right here so that this more vertical wall section is separate from this more sort of flatter wall section. And for the more vertical one, I want to cut an edge loop right here, or cut a seam right here, I should say. Then down here, we're already separating these into UV shells, but if I double click over here to split a seam, this is going to unfold as well. So as it stands right now, I've just gone through the object and defined all the seams. So now that I've defined all the seams, I have to actually unfold everything. Okay, lay it out. And the way I'm going to do that is just right click on the object, go to component, go to UV shell. Now we've defined a bunch of different UV shells. You can see as I hover over them with my mouse, they get sort of highlighted. I'm going to do them all at once. So I'm just going to click and drag to select everything. And then if I hit the D key on my keyboard, D, it'll unfold all those sections. And you can see it did a pretty good job, right? If we look at our checker map, you can see the squares are pretty consistent in size. On the sphere, you know, they get sort of bigger as they get to the middle, and some smaller as they get to the poles of the sphere. And that's just because spheres never unfold perfectly. It's pretty much impossible to take a sphere and fold it perfectly flat. So now that I've done that, I can go in my UV modeling toolkit here, and there's a little tool here called Optimize, and that just tries to really flatten things out as far as they'll go. So if I hit it, you can see that as I hit it, there's movement in the texture on the pawn. And really, I'm just going to hit it over and over again until that movement becomes so minor, so little, that it stops being worth it, because that's about as far as it can get. Like right now, I'm not really getting much extra, so it's flattened it out as far as I'm going to get it. Okay, so here are all the pieces. You can see even on the bottom here, everything's unfolded, right? So this is a pretty easy process. Now what we have here, these UV shells are sort of unfolded and they're at weird angles and stuff. So if I can come down here to arrange and layout, right? Usually these menus are all closed like this. So if I come open up arrange and layout, there's an orient shell. So it's going to orient them either vertically or horizontally. And that just so that they're not at an angle. And then I can open up transform. And if I hit Q to get out of the console tool, and I can right click, go to UV shell, select the UV shell. This one is the bottom section right here. So if I just rotate 180 degrees, just so that it's more or less, aligned the way that it's aligned in the on the actual model. And I'm just going to lay these in a way that uses up the least amount of space. So if I take the neck part of the pawn here and rotate it 90 degrees, I'm just going to bring it in over here somewhere, right? So these two are next to each other. Then we have, let's see, what's the next section here? We have this guy. We can put him off to the side. We have the next thing. We can put this off to the side here. We have this one here, which is this strip right here. And let's rotate that 90 degrees this way. Now this is the bottom of the pawn, so we can just slot this in here. It's a very convenient place to put it. And this, this guy can even go right here. And then we have the spherical section of the sphere, which is here. And let's see, we'll just rotate this way. And let me see here, right? Because I want to put the, I don't want to make it too tall, but I don't want to make it too wide either. So maybe I put this here like this. I take this one and do something like this. Right. Okay. And then maybe I take this one and bring it here. And this one, and maybe, you know, temporarily we'll put it right here. We'll see once we get to duplicating these, because again, the chessboard has, you know, 16 pawns. So for right now, we'll call this good, and we're just gonna just put it off to the side somewhere. Okay. Then let's look at our rook here. So same thing, right? UV. We're gonna run that planar map again, just to, you know, clear any of those bad UVs. Now I can also assign my checker map right here, and you can see that we got stretching on the sides. So we have to cut seams like we did before. So 3D cut and sew UV tool, so turn off, and we're going to split the bottom, right? Make it its own UV shell. Then come over here, split this, come to the top here and split it there. And let's maybe split right here. And then while we're here, let's go ahead and split. I'm just double clicking and double click here. We don't need to do anything there. And this one, actually, we can just double click here. So we just want to unfold all of these. So now we're left with this top section right here. What I'm going to do is just double click here like this, just to open this up. And then that will separate this flat section, which really doesn't need to be unfolded because it's already pretty flat. Okay. And then for the interfaces here, I'm just going to double click my way around this intersection here. Oops. There we go. Double click, click, double click, and so on. Okay, all the way until this becomes its own UV shell. And you can see that it did change color, so that is now set up as its own UV shell. Then for this top part, what I'm going to do is just double click all the way around here, and you'll see when it becomes its own UV shell right there. So these sections here inside these gaps are just going to be separated. So let's double click our way around. There's another one. There we go. And let's keep going. And there's another one. So those are going to be their own UV shells. And then for this last section here, I'm just going to split, double click a line right here to split it. Okay, so again, we need to select all the UV shells. So right click, component, UV shell, select all the UV shells and hit D on the keyboard. And there we go. All right, so if we look at this again, we're going to hit optimize a few times where there it is, unfold, optimize. And as you can see, nothing's really happening with this one when we optimize. So we are good. So we come down here to arrange and layout, orient shells. Then hit Q to get out of cut and sew, go to UV shell, select a UV shell, and I'm going to rotate this one 90 degrees. Let's bring the neck there. So we're just going to try to put these in a way that is as efficient as possible. So this one can go here. And these little guys right here can be, well, first we need to align them all the same kind of way here. Okay. Oops. And let's see, can we fit them in here? Yeah. Okay, that's a good place to throw those. And then this guy right here, let's see if we optimize him. Yeah, that one's not optimizing any further, so we'll call this okay for right now. So we'll bring this off to the side, right? So we're just going to go through and do them one by one. There we go. Let's look at the king. Again, pretty bad UVs. So UV planar. Okay. Then we get our 3D cut and sew UV tool, and you'll see that it's just the same pattern over and over again. Let's double click there, and we're gonna put our seam line up there. Double click here. Double click there. And let's go ahead and let's just cut all the way to here, right? Now you can experiment and see, different ways that you might try some things. But as long as you get a good result at the end, it really doesn't matter how you get there. And maybe here, and then double click up the side. This section is pretty much flat, so we can double click there and leave that without a seam going down the side because it's already pretty much flat. Now this part right here, what I'm actually going to do is just select that and do a quick bevel. Just so I have two segments there. Oops. Lower the fraction. Something like that. And let's go back in the 3D cut and sew tool here. Double click there. And notice that whenever I have the seams going vertically up, I try to get them to be matched up with all the UV shells because you don't want random seams all over the place. So I keep them on the same side. So this one needs one. Okay, that's pretty good. And then my little cross here. Let's see, we can go up and around. I'm just going to cut off the back section. Just like that. And then for this, I'm just going to cut at the corners. I think that should be a good way to lay this out. We'll find out. Okay. So now right click component UV shells, select all the UV shells, hit D, and that unfolds everything. Oh, we never put the shader on here, so if I go in object mode, oops, there we go, and then just apply that checker map. Okay, then we go into here in the UV shell mode, select all this, and let's do an optimize. And I'm not seeing any movement, so that's about as good as it's getting. Select this, in fact, select all of them, and we will do an orient shells. Now I'm looking over here, and that does not look right. Which part is this? Oh, that's this guy. Okay, let's unfold. There we go. So sometimes it doesn't unfold right for one reason or another, but that looks like it fixed it. Okay, so now we move these like this, and we can sort of work our way and arrange things nicely. Well, this one is actually between these two. Now what I can do too, because these things are sort of building up off each other, I can align them. So if I select all of these and then open align and snap and just align them, align all their centers. Not something that is a major deal, but doesn't hurt. Okay, then this part, and just put it somewhere. Take this guy, and you can just again rotate things and put them where you need to put them. As long as they're flat, how you arrange them doesn't really matter all that much. All right, so something like that. And again, these ones in the middle here, I may just align again. There we go. Okay, so that's the king. So select all those and just move it somewhere. So if we select all three of these, you can see that we have them all laid out. Okay, so we're going to go through all of them, and then we'll start to duplicate them off for the two sides of the chessboard. Okay, queen next. So, again, very repetitive. So UV planer, okay. UV cut and sew tool. Actually, before I do that, let me assign that shader. So I'll put the checker map. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and select these two and put the checker map on them too, just so that it's done. Okay, you can see because their UVs are so bad that they don't look anywhere near as nice as the rest of them. But we'll fix that. So Queen over here, UV, 3D cut and sew UV tool. So let's separate the base. Oh, and you know what? I just noticed that on the King, our base is... So if I go here to UV shell and click on the base, for some reason the base is really small. Now this is where we can get into texel density. So if we open up transform and then scroll all the way down till we see the words texel density. The texel density is just the scale value in relation to the UV shells, right? So if we want all the squares, like you see on the rook and the pawn, if you want all the squares within a single object to be more or less the same size, they need to have a matching texel density number. And so, because you can obviously see how big the squares are on the bottom versus everywhere else, this is not the same texel density as the rest. And to illustrate that, if I select that bottom UV shell and I go to right here, it says texel density, I go get, it's going to give me a number. Now that number itself for what we're doing is not necessarily all that important. It's just telling me what that relative scale is for that object. Now I'm going to click on a different UV shell and I'm going to get, and you see this is at 39 something. The other one was at 4 something, and this one is at 39. So we need to get the bottom to be at 39 just like the rest of it. So all I got to do is select that bottom part. Now that I've gotten that 39 value, if I take the bottom and just hit set, it's going to scale up that UV shell until it's about in the same texel density. So you can see now they match a lot better. So sometimes that will happen. You just need to be aware of it. And that's why we put the checker map on there, just so we can see these things and catch them before they become a problem later. Okay, so back to the queen. So let's get our 3D cut and sew UV tool here. And we already separated the bottom here. So again, we're going to separate the top. And we're going to cut a seam down the side. Separate there. And cut a seam. And we'll do this just like with the king. I'm just going to split here. Cut a seam. And maybe split this guy. Cut a seam. Okay. So let's come up here then. Because the queen has this sphere on the top, we're just going to split that off. And like we did with the pawn sphere, we're going to cut off the top and then split a seam over here. Then for this here, we're going to split this off. And we could probably leave this without a seam. We'll see. If we need to put a seam, we'll put a seam. Then just like with the rook, I'm just going to separate these inside faces here. So I'm just going to double click my way around. Oops. There we go. So we're just going to double click and go. There we go. So that's now a separate UV shell. And now that leaves this part here. And what I'm going to do is just split them at the points. Just double click. Okay, just work our way around and there we go. I think we got them all. And then this piece needs to be split here. And as you can see, because there's no line going up here, we can just click on, maybe, click on one of these and then that one, and then that seam will sort of go around there. Okay, it's just a little thing that we got to do there. So then we can right click component UV shell and select this, hit D, and that opens up, right? So then we hit optimize a few times. You can see some movement there, but that's pretty much gone after a few clicks. Then we scroll down, we orient our shells. Then I hit Q to get out of that tool. UV shell, grab this one. Then get the neck part here. Then maybe this one. And we'll just work our way up there. Let's rotate this 90 degrees. Maybe the other way. And this guy. Okay, I'm just going to drag these just down a little bit here. Okay, so now we can take all this, move it around here, and just sort of put it in places where it's not going to cause any trouble and it's going to not take up too much space. Something like that. Okay, I can take these. I'm just going to align them. And of course, we don't want any overlapping UVs, so we just need to make sure that these have enough room between them. And just like the others, we're just going to move it off to the side and just be done with it for right now. Then we have our bishop. Same deal again. Planar map to start. Then we go to UV, 3D Cut and Sew UV tool. Make sure that we're in edge mode. Double click. And double click there. Split this down the side here. Double click. All right, we're just gonna do exactly what we've been doing and work our way up. Oops, there we go. So another bishop, of course, because it has this slot here, becomes a bit of a problem, but nothing major. Let's go ahead and just split off the sphere. Split there. And our seam comes up here, so we'll split there. Now for the slot section here, because I beveled it, I can just double click this center piece here, and that just becomes its own UV shell, and that'll unfold really nicely. Now for this part right here, let's see how we're going to do this here. We are going to split it right up the side here. And then we'll also split right here. I think that should be enough. And if it isn't, we'll fix it. But let's right click component UV shell. Select all this, hit D. And yep, that looks pretty good. Let's optimize. There you can see there's still some movement in that top piece. So I'm going to keep hitting optimize here. And it's getting less and less. You know, you don't have to go on forever, but I'm going to call that good. Scroll down, orient shells. Hit Q to get out of that tool. Select this. And let's flip this 180 degrees. Bring it down. Get this one. Bring that down here. Next one. Rotate it. Bring it, bring it down. This one, let's rotate that way, bring it down here. And then we have this part right here. We got the sphere on the top. Actually, can we sneak this in here? I think so, yep. And that little circle, put it there. This is the base. And this is that slot on the inside, which I guess we can just rotate it like this, just so that it fits over here. So there's our bishop, right? So we'll just move that over here. So bishop is good. Okay, if you look at them, they all look pretty well laid out. Now we have our knight. And again, same thing, UV, planar. Okay, now UV cut and sew tool. Make sure in edge mode, double click, separate that. And here we could probably split it right here. Right, and let's see how, right there. And then because this is actually in two parts right here, we're just gonna come in real close and make sure we're getting the correct edge. I think that's it. Yep. And double click there. Now, for the actual horse itself, first, what we can do is just get rid of the interfaces of the mouth. So just like we did with the slot on the bishop, we can do the same here. So I'm just going to double click my way around the mouth here, just to separate those faces from the rest of the head. As you can see, they're separate UV shell. It's going to make our life a little bit easier. And then I'm just going to double click going up the side here. It's hard to see, but now you can see the seam there. Is it easier if I do that? Okay, so here, if I just click once on an edge, maybe, there we go. It'll, because it's next to a seam that's already there, it'll cut a seam, because if I double click, it's going to go too far. So if I just click and click, now the ears, I can just cut around them. Just go around and double click to make them their own UV shell. There we go, just like that. And let's do the same on this side. So I'm just going to double click my way around my ear. There we go. It becomes its own UV shell. And then I can split it. Actually, I want to split up the back to about here. So what I can do is just click here once and shift double click here. It's going to cut a seam between those points. So same thing here. Click once there, shift double click where you want it to end, and it's going to cut a seam there. And then I can sort of double click here, which is going to cut a seam, and double click, and then wrong one, double click there. And I think, let's see, yep, I think that seam is complete. And then I want to actually separate the head from the rest of the body. So, I just got to find somewhere. Actually, before I do that, let's separate the mane here from it. So if I double click this side, double click here, and double click going down that way, and then maybe double click across here, that's going to make it its own UV shell. And I can click on here and click on here. That'll just open that up really nicely there. And click here, this one and this one. Okay. And then to complete sort of separating the head, I can click here and click here. There we go. So now the head is a different UV shell from the neck. And we just got to see how we want this head to open up. Might have to split it on the bottom here, but we'll see. And then for the back of the neck, just double click here to create a seam. Okay, so there's a lot going on there, but again, it's all pretty logical. And then because it has a flat face as well, I'm just going to double click here to separate that. Okay, let's see what we got. So right click, component, UV shell, drag a selection and hit D. Right, and that actually looks not so bad. I just want to see what the head is doing. Yeah, the head needs to be split here because you can see that it's causing a lot of stretching there. So what I can do is, again, go back to this and right click component edge and just double click this edge underneath here. And then what we can do is hit Q to get out of that tool, right click UV shell, select the head shell and just unfold it and then optimize it. Just hitting that over and over and over again. There we go. Okay, so now select all the UV shells and orient shells and then just start arranging some of this stuff here. So there's a neck, that's the head. This is the part of the base here. This one is the other part of the base. This is our main. So we can sort of move this to the side here. This one is our base. This one is the bottom of the actual knight head itself. Well, the upper section, I should say. So select that, and then this one. And these are the two ears right here. And those ears are, they've unfolded okay. So we'll just put them in here. Maybe flip this one the other way. There we go. And what's left? This guy, which is the inside of the mouth. Again, we'll find a way to put that. Okay. So if we look at the maps, that looks pretty good. Okay. Now the next thing we want to do is match texel density between all of these. Each one of these has its own texel density, right? If I select the knight and go to UV shell and grab one of the pieces and get the texel density, it's about 39. Actually, it's pretty close. So now let's go to the bishop and get the texel density. That's about 44. The queen is about 39, so that's pretty close. The king is also about 39. That's pretty close. The rook is about 40. So they're actually not too far off from each other, which is actually really good. This one is 51. So that one is different. So what I'm going to do is just select all the pieces so we can see them all. And let's say we're just going to make everything 40. Right, so if I go to UV shell, select everything, go in here and just punch a 40 in here, because again, the number is not really that important, and go to set. Oops. Uh-oh. I think I might have crashed mine. Let me see what I can do to fix that, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I'm not sure what happened there, but what I'm going to do, just to be safe, I'm going to do these one by one. So I'm going to make this 40. Select the next one, 40. See, and that one is a pawn. I'll come back and fix that. Select this one, 40. Right, and just go through them piece by piece. Set this one to 40. Okay, so something about the knight it doesn't like, so we will see here in a sec. Okay, so after dealing with that, I'm not sure what the problem was, but anyway. So again, we're just going to set the knight to 40. So set, get our king, set, and so on. All right, so everything now should be set to a texel density of 40. That way, if they're made of some kind of wood that has a sort of wood texture grain or anything like that, you want that grain to be the same size on all the pieces, right? You don't want it to be really big on one and really small on the other. So now these pieces are all laid out. Now a chessboard obviously doesn't have just one of each piece, right? For one, you have 16 pawns. So let's go ahead and start with the pawns. And what we're going to do, we're going to lay these out using the UDIM tiles, right? All the positive tiles, the ones that have little numbers, 1001, 1002, etc., right? What you don't want is to have your UVs in the tiles that are outside of this upper right quadrant. So these other three quadrants are sort of off bounds because the numbers are negatives. We want to keep everything in this upper right quadrant. So this pawn is going to have to move to over here. Now, like I said, we're going to have 16 pawns, which is 8 per side. We don't want to use an entire UDIM tile for one pawn because we're going to have a lot of UDIM tiles if we do it that way. So what I'm going to try to do is put 4 pawns per UDIM tile. So it'll be 2 UDIM tiles per side for the light side and the dark side of pawns, right? 4 on each tile. So since I adjusted the texel density, some of these have spread out a little bit. So I'm going to just bring them back, tighten them up a little bit just to help with packing these together. Okay. So something like that. Now, like I say, I want to have 4 of these per tile. So I'm actually going to scale this down. And actually, you know what? Before I do the pawn, if I scale anything, it's going to change its texel density relative to all the other pieces. Right now, they all match as far as the texel density size. So if I go and select them all, just so we can see them all in the UV editor, we know that the king is the biggest piece. So the king will probably get its own UV tile. So I need to get all the parts of the king and fit them into a UV tile just so that I know that I have enough room in there. Right, just to make sure that it's going to fit in its own UV tile, and it's going to define, it's basically going to define the texel density for everything else. Okay, so these are the UV shells for the king. So I'm just going to pick a UV tile here, and I want to scale it down, but I want to scale them all at the same time while keeping my eye on the king. And the reason I scale them all down at the same time is so that the texel density continues to match between them. If I scale only one or two of them and don't scale the rest, then you're going to have, two sets of texel densities. But if I scale everything down or up at the same time, then relative to each other, that texel density is going to stay the same. So if I just scale this down, just so because I want this king to be able to fit in a UV tile. So something like that. And king fits in there real nice. And if the king fits, then everything else should fit. Now, the trouble comes when you're trying to fit multiple things per tile, like these pawns right here. So let's see if with this set the way that it is, let's see if we can fit more than one pawn in a tile. So so we may have to rearrange a couple of things here. See if that works. Maybe not. Maybe I'll keep this here and just bring this down. Now it's important that the objects never cross over the line like that. Right? Let me turn off the colors here. So I'm going to give them a little bit of room there. Okay, so just looking at this, I can tell that I'm not going to be able to fit 4 of these in here. So I'm actually going to make this smaller, which means I'm going to select everything again and shrink it down some more. Now let's see. I could potentially get 4 of these in here, right? So let's look at that. So now to get the next one, I'm going to just select my pawn and Control D to duplicate it and just move it over. And now I have the UVs for the duplicate selected. If I go to UV shell and just move these over this way and then select the other one, you see we have a little bit of overlap here. So I have to take that into account. Right, if I look at these, probably not going to be able to get 4 of these in here. I could get 2. But if I really want to get 4, then I might have to scale things down some more. Okay, so let me get rid of this one and select all of the pieces. Go to UV shell, select everything, and scale it down some more. So now when I do this one, and then go to UV, go to object mode, select it, duplicate it, move the duplicate over. And let's take that duplicate and move it this way, and then shift select the other pawn here. And I'm still a little bit big here. Let me take these and bring them on this side so that maybe I move this up just a bit. Now I want to put the other 2 up here, but I may not be able to get them to fit. Let's see. Okay, so if we now go in object mode and select both these pawns, Control D to duplicate them, and then take these, flip them 180 degrees, and then move them up. Let's see, will that? Yeah, it's not going to fit. That's not going to fit. Now, I could keep scaling down, but the problem now is that if I keep scaling this king down, where's the king? The king is here. You see that the king is now quite a bit smaller than the space that I have. So again, this is always going to be a bit of a trial and error. So I'm going to actually get rid of 3 of these. Let's go into object mode. Get rid of those and go back to just my original pieces here. So I'm going to just resign to having not four, but 2 pawns per tile instead of 4. That's going to allow me to have a bigger king, which is going to use up a little bit more texture space and not waste so much. So again, if I select everything here, I'm just going to scale this up so that my king again can fit really nicely in here. Okay, and again, I'm looking at the king here, but I'm scaling everything and moving it as a unit. So scale up again, move maybe a little bit more. Okay, so now I'm really sort of pushing the limits here. Maybe a scale just a hair down. So something like that. Now that means that some things are going to have to move, like these can come in here. That's not a big deal. Maybe this one goes here, and then this one, yeah, we go. There we go. So that's a much more efficient use of the UV tile. So we know that the king's going to fit. So now at this texel density, let's go and see what we can do here. So if that is 1 pawn's location, and we duplicate it, move it over, take this UV shells, flip them 180 degrees, and move them here. Will that be... Yeah, that might work. Okay, so what I can do, and I'm going to delete this, and the reason I keep deleting is because I want these UV tiles, UV shell layouts to be exactly the same, even though one is flipped 180 degrees. So I think just by moving some of these, basically I'm going to use half of my UV tile for the 1 pawn and then another half of the other. So I'm actually going to move this over a little bit here. Maybe take this down here, just slide this over so it doesn't bump into the other pawn when I duplicate it. Okay, so something like that. Okay, so now I can duplicate this guy, move it over, select this layout here, and then flip it 180 degrees. Move it over. Let's see. Okay, so still a little bit of a clash there, but I think we can fix this. And so again, you know, it's a bit of a trial and error that we have to go through. Let me just move this down here. Okay, and then this guy goes over here. So hopefully that'll fit now. Let's duplicate it, Control D, move this over, select the layout and flip it 180 and move it there. And there we go. So now we have this UV layout, 2 UV layouts that fit well in the same UV tile. Okay, so we'll get 2 per. Okay, so now we duplicate both of these, move them over. And now I just want to take this UV layout and move it to the next tile. So right click UV shell, select them all. And instead of trying to eyeball it, what I'm going to do is under the transform menu, there's this move section right here. So make sure that 1 is the number in here. And we're just going to use the right arrow to move things to the right 1 square, just like that. Okay, so now if we select these, you'll see that they have the exact same layout, but it's a square over. So that's a total of 4 pawns, right? So if I go in object mode, select all 4, Control D again, now we're going to have our 8 pawns. So now we got these 4 pawns that we need to move 2 more squares this way. So if I select all these UV shells, and I'm going to move over 2 squares, so 1, 2. So when we select all all 8 pawns, you'll see that we have 2, 4, 6, 8, covering 4 UV tiles. Okay, and these are the pawns for one side of the board. So we need the 8 for the other side of the board. So if we right click in here and select all 8 of these, Control D to duplicate them, and these will be the pawns for the other side of the board. So those 8, we're going to take these 4 tiles and move them up 1. So if I right click UV shell, select all this, and go up 1 tile. Now when I select all 16, you'll see that they're all set up nicely in the UV layout. Okay, so we have 16. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to use 1 row for one side of the board, and then the other row is going to be identical, but it'll be for the other side of the board. Okay, so light and dark color, or whatever you want to call them. Okay, so 16 pawns, like 8 per side. Let's go to the rooks. Now remember, I can't scale these up or down. These have to stay in this scale now because that texel density has been established. So, and I'm going to select all the pawns with the rook just so I know which UV tile I need to put the rook into. So if I now select the rook here and move it, now you can see that my rook in this case is using up basically an entire tile by itself, which is fine. So I'm going to just space out some of these things to give them a little room. Okay. So now we know that each side of the board has 2 rooks. So it means I got to duplicate this one, Control D, move it over, and then select this one and move it over 1 square so that the 2 rooks are next to each other like that. Then I'm going to select both rooks again, Control D to duplicate and move them. And then these UV shells get moved up a square. So if we look at everything we have so far, we've got our 16 pawns, and then we have our 4 rooks, 2 per side. Okay. King. So I'm going to select everything up to the king here just so I can see everything all at once. So the king will fit in his own UV tile like that. And there's 1 king per side, so we only need 2 kings total. So Control D, move this over, take this UV layout and move it up 1. Oops. Move it up 1 so that now both kings. And if we select everything, you can see this is what we're getting. Okay. Now, you can see that our UV tiles, it looks like we're running out of UV tiles going to the right. We're actually not. The grid is just showing up to 10 tiles in each direction. But it actually goes on forever. So you could have more stuff, and you can even go in the options and make the grid bigger so that it shows more squares. So if we wanted to, we could just keep going to the right, but we could also go upward. So if it's getting to be too long, what we can do is have 2 rows per side of the chessboard. So the way to do that is just right click, go to UV shell. I'm going to select everything on this second row here, and just move it up one row. So move it up. So these first 2 rows will belong to one side, and then the next 2 rows will belong to the other side. That way we're not having this sort of go off forever to the right. We're sort of building upwards as well as sideways. Okay. And that's just a personal preference thing. Again, you could just keep going to the right and have a long line of UV shells. That's fine. But just to keep things within a reasonable viewing area, so that I don't have to zoom out for a mile just to be able to see all my UV shells as they stretch, to the right. This way I can be pretty close and still see everything. So let's look at our queen here. And there's our queen. And I go to UV shell. Now she should fit in a square with some little rearrangements here. Okay, and again, remember, we're not scaling anything. We have to just get everything to fit at the scale it's in. But if the king fits at this scale, then everything else will fit because the king is the biggest. So there's our queen. And there are 2 queens per side, right? So I'm sorry, 1 queen per side, so 2 total. Control D to duplicate it. Now this one has to go up 2 squares, right? Because it's on the second row of the other one as well. So we'll just go 1, 2. Okay, so now if we select these 2, you'll see that, or if we select everything up to the queens, you'll see that this is what we have right here. Okay, so there's the queens. Now the bishops, again, we have 2 bishops per side, so we need a total of 4. So if we select everything, including the bishop, and there's the bishop right there, and we're going to move this bishop there like this. Fits in nicely. Okay, and we need a second bishop for this side, so if we Control D, move this over, select this UV shell and move it across one tile. Then, if we select all of these, there's our 2 bishops. So we need 2 more. So if I select both of these, Control D and slide them over. Now what we have to do is take these and move them up 2 squares. So 1, 2. Correct? So now we select everything. Oh, I undid by mistake, so I still need to go up 1. There we go. Okay, so there's our 2 bishops for both sides. Okay. Then we have our knights. So there's a knight, UV shell, grab it and move this here, making sure that it fits, and it does. Okay, so we need to duplicate this, Control D, move this over, select this, and slide it over 1 square. And if we look at these 2 and duplicate them, Control D, move them. Then we select all of this and go up 2 squares. 1, 2. Okay, now if we select everything, this is what we have. Okay. Now, we could go into these UV shells. What piece is this? These are the kings, actually. We could just take them, move them up 1 and the left 1 just to fit them in there. Now we have a more sort of even grid of pieces here. Right, and there we go. So there is our UV layout for all the chess pieces at the matching texel density without having too many UV tiles used up. So we got a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 by 1, 2, 3, 4. So what is that? 24. Okay, so we have 24 UV tiles for our pieces. That should give us a pretty decent layout for our textures. Okay, so that is the UV layout for all the pawns. Now the reason we, instead of just having all 16 pawns read from the same single layout, this allows us to have variation across the pieces. If we just stack all the UV shells for all the pawns, what happens is every single pawn is going to be 100% identical to the next pawn, and you don't really want that. So you want to have the variation. So that is how we set up our UV layouts for the chess pieces, and that should give you a nice ability to texture this and make it look really good. All right.